We all have visions of growing the perfect garden with beautiful flowers and produce as far as the eye can see. But what if reality for us is more like the surface of the sun, with scorched wastelands and no water to be found? Come along for tips in growing in hot temperatures and desert climates.
Hey, it's Jake with the Roaming Homesteaders. I'm in the garden here today. It's Tuesday, August 16th. It's about 6 p.m. local time here in Northern California, and it is 106 degrees outside. And you know what? Today is actually a cool day compared to what it's been in the last week. We've had temperatures as high as 112, 113 degrees. And I got to thinking about how it's affecting our garden and what we're doing out here. And I wanted to share with you a few of the things that we do in order to garden in the middle of heat like this. Now, some of you might be used to this sort of temperature all the time, like we have been for the last several years, but others might be dealing with these heat waves that are going on all over the country. And a lot of gardeners that I've seen on Facebook and other chat groups have been really struggling with the heat. It's been killing their plants. They don't know how to cope with it. And I wanted to share with you some of the things that we do in our garden in order to garden in a climate like this. Water is certainly a big part of it, but there's some other tricks and hints that I want to share with you today to show you how you can garden in a high temperature area, or how you can adjust when you're dealing with these temperature changes that we've been having all over the place in the last couple of years, so that you don't lose your gardens and you can actually thrive. There's a couple videos I'm going to link in here. I think one that I can think of is from Baker Creek, talking about plants that love the heat. But you can grow things that aren't necessarily heat resistant or don't love the heat, even in this sort of heat. And I'm going to show you what we do here on the homestead and how we grow the vegetables that we grow, even in 110 degree temperatures. One of the first things that we do is we will put down this black woven ground cloth. You've seen it on a number of channels online, and it's pretty prevalent in the homesteading communities that we've seen. And we got this idea last year from a couple of our friends out in Missouri. But what they use this ground cloth, it's about 2.5, 3 feet wide. It comes in a big roll of 400 or 500 feet, for a couple $100. And it's woven, and if you look at it really closely, you can see that it has this woven structure here. It's not just straight plastic. And if you cut it, the reason that woven is good, it's UV reinforced, UV chemical resistant, UV resistant, and it's woven, and that means that when you cut it, it won't unravel. So this is really helpful because you can do what we've done here, which is install the ground cloth, and you can put the spikes down in it, hold the ground cloth together, and then you can cut holes in it for your plants. So what we've done here is we've actually cut some holes in rows. This was our cornfield, and we were able to grow right through the fabric. And why this is helpful is you can cover up your ground. It will actually suppress weeds, and it will also conserve moisture. So this is really helpful in cutting down the weeds and conserving moisture for hot area gardening. Another thing that's really useful is putting in drip irrigation lines. You might have seen the lines here in the last photo, and I'll show this to you again. But when you run drip irrigation lines across your ground and you line up the holes so that they drip right into the holes that you've cut in your ground cloth, you actually target your moisture. You help make sure that it gets under that ground cloth and straight to your plants, and then it helps conserve water. So there are times when we'll throw the sprinklers on and we'll just soak everything just to get moisture back into the garden. But for the most part, our weekly watering routine is drip irrigation, and that really conserves on water. And with the combination of that ground cloth, you'll be able to keep a lot of that water from evaporating like you would if you were just had open ground that you were maintaining. You know, we're here in Northern California in the Central Valley, and we need to keep that moisture in the ground. And if we just had it open and out into the air, it would get sucked out and evaporate very, very quickly. So having this ground cloth and the drip irrigation ensures that we can keep that ground moist and keep the things growing through the ground cloth growing very, very well, even though it's very hot. And what we did here is we ran a number of, I think these are 1 gallon drip emitters, and we actually tied them in. You know, they're kind of hidden by the grass right now, but if you look under the edge of our grass, we have these manifolds under here that are just, you know, standard. I think these are 1/2 inch or 5/8 drip irrigation line, and then they're tied in with the T connectors, and they go out into our garden in rows. I think these are set on 30-inch rows or a little bit narrower. And what I'll do is, you know, I'll set this up so that you have valves here at different places. You know, these are like $1 each, and you can turn the valves on and off, and you can target the drip irrigation. So these lines have these valves on them, and I can tailor my watering for the needs of the garden. Another thing we use in our garden is vertical trellising. Here we have about 40 feet of cattle panel or hog panel that we've actually mounted between T-posts in the garden. These are 6-foot T-posts, they're driven in, or 5-foot T-posts, they're driven into the ground, and then we have the cattle panel on top of them. And this year we've woven our tomatoes and our marigolds into them. And if you see here, what that helps us do is that helps us to get our plants off the ground and growing vertically so that they're not laying all over the ground. And really all they need is for the growing point at the bottom of the trellis to be exposed. And then of course here we have the drip line that drips right into the hole. And that helps us keep these plants and only these plants watered. And then they have this vertical space to grow on, and it's very convenient for picking, and it also helps for water conservation because we can just turn this one drip line on and it just drips right into the hole, and after about 20 minutes or half hour these plants have all the water that they need. And as you can see, you know, we actually get, you know, a really decent amount of fruit off them. You know, these were just picked. Yeah. Kids are out here in the garden. These were just picked, but we have a few other fruits here. We've got a tomato here, and we have lots of other things coming along. Something else that we take advantage of in the garden is selective use of shade. So on this side of the garden, you might see that we have another vertical trellis, and it's set up so that we have our beans on it. So we have a lot of beans, and then at the further end we have some tomatoes and some cucumbers. But this is oriented in a north-south direction. And because this is north-south, obviously, in the afternoon, everything on this side of the trellis is shaded. And in the morning, because it's so close to our fence over here, in the morning it's also shaded. So for a good portion of the day, this is a shady alleyway going down the side of our garden. And we have a sprinkler running down here. And this creates sort of a microclimate where we can actually grow things that would require a little more moisture, a little more shade. And even though the air temperature is pretty high, we actually see on this side of the garden, we see a lot more bee activity. Unfortunately, we have a lot of wasps out right now, but we see a lot more bee activity. It's cooler generally later in the morning and earlier in the evening. And what grows over here, you wouldn't normally think is something that could grow over here. We have a lot of cucumbers, a lot of beans. I mean, I have a bean trellis that's still flowering, and it's been 110 degrees outside for, you know, a couple of months now. Very hot. And, you know, Obviously, some of the varieties help, but for the most part, this creates a microclimate in our garden that helps us grow more in the hot temperatures. This is the backside of that tomato trellis that I just showed you, and as I said, with the other bean wall, we call it the bean wall, over across the backside of the garden, over there, the backside is where we grow some of these things in the shade. We do the same thing inside the garden. So over here, we have some okra that's planted. I know this okra is kind of short. It's a short variety. It's sort of a dwarf variety of okra from Baker Creek. Hasn't done very well here before, but this year we planted it in the shade of the tomato wall, and it's actually doing pretty well. I mean, this stuff looks great compared to some of the other times that we've tried to grow this in the full sun here in our area. And for the most part, we're actually getting some decent production out of this short little wall of okra because we are growing it in the shade of those tomatoes and those marigolds that we're growing. So that's another way that you can create microclimates in your garden, by using the shade of some other structure like we've done here. Something else you might notice above me is shade cloth. They call this shade cloth. This is a product, this is a UV stabilized woven cloth that actually cuts down the amount of sun reaching the ground underneath of it. And there's different types of shade cloth. You can buy it from greenhouse growers or any of these greenhouse solutions or places that sell greenhouse plastic or fabrics. You can also buy it on Amazon. I think I actually got this on Amazon about 3 or 4 years ago. But you need to get UV stabilized or UV resistant, and make sure it's a proper brand and it's not just a knockoff. Look at the reviews, see if it's been UV stabilized, because what happens is this stuff's made out of plastic, and if it's been UV stabilized, it will last. This plastic, I don't know if you can see me pushing on this. This plastic is 3 or 4 years old. It's been out in the summer for a good portion of that time in the sun, and it's just as flexible and pliable as when we bought it. Maybe just a little bit less, but my point is it's not turning to powder. It's not just disintegrating. And this particular shade cloth that we use here is 30% shade cloth. You can get 10% shade cloth, 15, 20, 30, 50, 70. There's all sorts of levels of shade cloth, and depending on what you want to grow and your location and how intense the sun is in the summer or any time, you can get the right shade cloth. For my area, I recommend in California or super sunny locations sort of south of the Oregon border or Pennsylvania, I recommend 30% shade cloth, because it's just enough to cut down the heat and the roasting temperatures of the sun without denying your plants really a lot of that solar energy that they need. And what I've done here, we actually only installed this because I realized, this year I was trying to get away with not putting it up just because I was being lazy, but I was experiencing a lot of sunburn on my vegetables and a lot of heat stress. And I decided, when we were pulling out the squash and the pumpkins, I just decided I was going to go ahead and put up all the shade cloth for the rest of the year, because believe it or not, we have another 3 months of growing here. It's the middle of August, but we can grow all the way up until about Thanksgiving and beyond. And we really do need to cut down on some of the sun. And I'll show you how that's benefited us already. So these are our pepper plants. I think we've put in about 30 pepper plants here, and you'll have to forgive the cucumbers. I just cleaned out a cucumber vine, and I had to pull all the ones that were overripe. We're going to go ahead and process these for seed soon, but one of the things I was able to do is get in here and weed my peppers and to do a little maintenance on them. Now, peppers in our climate don't do very well. It's really too hot and too dry. When you go to places like New Mexico, it's certainly dry, but you have a lot more irrigation, and it's a little bit different. You're further south than we are here, so the sun technically is a little more intense, but they're able to irrigate and shade in some of these valleys in New Mexico so that the peppers aren't getting, intense heat, 12, 14 hours a day. They're only getting it for 7 or 8. And with the water, they can grow them very, very well. Now, I need to fertilize these peppers again, but I think what you can see is they're just covered in fruit. And what you would see before I put this shade cloth up here about a month ago, what you would see is these fruit would be growing and they would be drying out or burning, and there would be holes developing in the fruit, and they would not be ripening enough to turn colors before they just shriveled up and died. And the plants themselves weren't doing so well. Now what you're seeing with these plants is they're getting just enough sunlight to ripen these peppers up. I wouldn't say just enough, they're still getting a lot of sunlight, but they're getting 70% of the normal sunlight because this is a 30% shade cloth. And you're just seeing really healthy looking peppers. They're not developing holes, they're turning beautiful colors, and they're just ripening up so that we don't have to rush to pick them off the plants. And they're just looking beautiful. I'm excited to get out and pick some of these here shortly. And the plants are still healthy, and you can see that in this cooler climate, they're still flowering, and these plants here are actually starting to flower more. So we're really pleased, and this shade cloth has ensured that we can have a really great pepper harvest. And we're about to get out here and harvest and then fertilize and then get the plants going some more. And here's sort of a dramatic example. The shade cloth here is stretched over the edge, but as everybody knows, the angle of the sun means that unless you're a couple of feet back into the garden, you're still going to get blasted with the sun. So if you look here, you're going to see a stark example. These are 6 pepper plants that are at the edge that still get a lot of sun. They're not properly shaded. And you can see that they're okay. They're alive. I water them properly, but they're short and they're a little stunted and they don't have as many peppers. And then when you go into the shaded area, suddenly the peppers get taller and healthier looking, and they have a lot more fruit on them. Look at this guy. These 2 here have about 10 fruit on them each, and then you go out here and this is shorter and smaller and they only have 2 or 3. So there's a good example of just the benefit of having this shade cloth and placing your plants over top. Here's a great example of what can happen in the high heat environment. You have this beautiful, I think these are purple coneflowers that were started. They're not flowering yet, obviously, but they're very lush. We keep them well watered. And then just behind it is a pot that I stopped watering, and just within a couple of weeks, that's what you get. Just bone dry. Yeah, so, things can be very green, and then you get that. So, and if you look, we have this garden area. We have some trees that we've planted over here. This is a very sort of different little microclimate. We keep these well watered. You can see that they're growing in their pots. And then you look at the rest of the yard, and it just looks like the desert. Here's another example of a microclimate that we're taking advantage of near our house. This wall is shaded except for 3 or 4 hours in the evening when it gets the sun like it does right now. Otherwise, we have elderberries over there in pots. This is a couple of apples and a pear tree. These are shaded for most of the day, so we're growing stuff there. And then these we just keep watered and watered and watered because we want them to grow. But you can see the stark differences in our yard. The places that are not getting water are just blasted wasteland. And then where we're implementing some of these practices, you actually have a decent garden. Lastly, along with these sort of structural things you can do, growing vertically using ground cloth, drip lines, growing things in the shade of vertical walls, and taking advantage of shade cloth, there's management practices. Obviously, if you get a good understanding of the type of water requirements that your garden needs, with those sort of things, you can manage how much water you're putting into the garden, and you can help simulate sort of nature a little bit with proper levels of moisture and water and nutrients coming into your garden. And those will certainly help keep your plants stress-free in a high temperature environment like this. But another thing is just sort of proper management practices. You'll want to water at the right times of the day. If you turn your sprinklers on to water at noon, that'll certainly cool things down, but you're going to get a lot of evaporation, a lot more than if you watered early in the morning or late in the evening. Last night, for instance, I was out here watering after midnight. That just happened to be a good time at night that I was able to come out and do that. But that's an example of a water management practice, and it helped get those same things soaked in at a time where they wouldn't immediately evaporate. So timing your waterings, making sure that you're getting them done at the right time of day, and how you're putting it into the garden so that it won't just evaporate and be a waste is very helpful too. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Roaming Homesteaders, and that it's given you some tips on how to deal with a garden in high temperature environments like we have here in Northern California. It's a challenging way to garden, but it can be very rewarding. I'll tell you, you really get some real growth factors if you're getting the proper water and nutrients to your vegetables. In addition to this sort of heat, you can have just explosive growth. Almost as much as you would get when you're in a high solar environment like Alaska, where you're getting 16, 18 hours or more of sunlight a day and growing those giant vegetables that you see. You can get similar growth in high temperature environments, especially places like the West or in the South, when you have the proper combination, and you can really take advantage of it too. So I hope this has taught you something, given you something to think about and to look into more. If you like our channel, please subscribe and click the bell so that you're notified whenever we release new videos. And as always, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye.